Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, a series curated by Monocle Solutions where we balance the books in the dynamic world of finance. I'm your host as always, Michael Avery, steering you through this ever-shifting story of the rands and cents and also the bits and bytes in this series. Well, why is everyone talking about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, but with little to offer in the way of practical application? Is it a revolution in waiting, or do we need to see less chat and more action and traction? Well, today we've got a fascinating conversation lined up with two distinguished guests, Joshua Kaiser, who's the CEO of Tovie AI, and Goh Hirose, who is head of digital acceleration at BNP Paribas Cardif. Josh is an experienced tech architect and entrepreneur specializing in machine learning and AI-based product development. His whole career has been focused on helping businesses solve problems with conversational AI technologies, and Goh has quite an international upbringing in the US and Germany and Japan, and he has worked passionately in the intersection of arts, innovation, and the well-being of society. So a very interesting career that both gentlemen have had, and I'm really looking forward to the next 30 minutes to find out how we're starting to see AI applications influence and intersect the world of finance and human interaction as well. So thanks both for joining us. Josh, maybe you can just kick us off. You've got a rich background in conversational AI, so maybe you can just share a little bit more about your professional journey and how it led you to become the CEO of Tovie AI.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So it's a little bit of an interesting one. So my background, funny enough, was in finance and economics. That's what I studied at university. I sort of had this dream to go and become an investment banker. And second year university, did a couple of internships and decided actually working directly in finance wasn't for me, if you like. So I pivoted the course of my career and ended up investing a significant amount of time in upskilling myself in the technology space. Started a few companies, not necessarily in AI, but in general technology, fashion technology for one. Dabbled a little bit in the early days of blockchain, and fundamentally ended up working across a variety of different consultancies with a focus on technology delivery for large enterprise, and in particular for financial services companies. While I was working for those companies, I very quickly realized it was sort of this early 2010s, if you like, there was a bit of a resurgence when it came to AI, technology not being necessarily new, but the hardware and the infrastructure through cloud, making it more accessible, allowing use cases to actually become practical, given the sheer number of data that was available and the infrastructure at play. And so I took a bit of a bet that, these types of technologies in particular with a focus on automation have tremendous value to the organization, both in terms of, should we say, cost reduction, but also revenue augmentation, and sort of delved into that space, very much focusing first on contact center automation and then sort of widening out from there. And around 2020, I was brought in to Tovie by the private equity firm that holds a majority stake in the company to help grow the business internationally. And we've been fairly successful at doing so.
And there's a lot to unpack in that, from the early days of things like machine learning and automating and robotic process, automation. And the early days, I think, particularly of bots, there were many bodies littered on the shores of the early adopters versus where we are today and how the technology has evolved. But Goh, your career spans various industries, from aviation IT, management consulting, now digital transformation at BNP Paribas Cardif. Maybe you could just share a little bit more about how you've cultivated an interest that's so broad and diverse across not only IT, but the arts and the intersection of human well-being.
Yeah, thank you for having me on this show. It's really interesting to talk about these subjects from, let's say, a business perspective, because I didn't always see this as some business activity, but more something like people might call their calling. When I was younger, I really started out in wanting to do something creative. I've always been into coding, programming, I guess gaming. Back in, the early 80s was kind of the start of getting into computers and how they work. And early on, in elementary school, middle school, I got into coding and I really liked technology. But what I found fascinating when I started music, which I also started in my younger years, was the impact it had on people's thinking, emotion. If you think about movies, the camera kind of pursues what your attention should go to, but the music kind of guides your heart and your emotion. It's that unseen power to in a way, influence people to be happy or to guide them into, oh, something dangerous is about to happen. I thought that was really fascinating, which took me into things around psychology. And a lot of the research and things I was interested in, like in university, also, it was really driven by the technology I had at the time. It's really hard to quantify, for example, things around psychology. If you go more towards cognitive psychology and about how like the brain works, you can get a little bit more statistical data from that. And looking at these kind of statistics and trying to find patterns in people's behavior, that was always something really interesting for me. And naturally, being a musician, like I found that interesting also, that, let's say, borderline between the human organically playing an instrument, but you play it through like an electric bass, for example, going through sound processing, leading to the speakers, reaching someone's ear, again, becoming suddenly very organic, turning into a chain reaction of the human, which is what I think is an emotion. It's like a chain reaction of things. And looking at that like dynamic, I was really into music entertainment, and I thought that would be a really fun field for me if I wanted to make a lot of people happy. But this is like the young me. So now I'm 45. Back then I was in my teens, and I guess I saw the world in a very simplistic way. But at some point in my music and creative career, I'm skipping a lot of years, but I realized that, okay, like what really does have a impact on people's happiness. It's not just to have a good time at a concert. A lot of people struggle, and I learned this as many musicians and creators would probably resonate, is in their finances and trying to survive. And even as an entrepreneur, I also do stuff in beauty and cosmetics, but different businesses, they always have challenges around financing, cash flow, and obviously things like insurance help people as a safety net in these kind of situations. And it really led me to, okay, I want to try and discover what I could do in finance. And even as I moved to working in finance, and I started in BNP Paribas Cardif in Japan, that was my first chance in working in finance. And it was after I worked in aviation IT, and I was also doing a few companies that I launched, including foreign language acquisition. And it was this online course that we were building with connecting different teachers. It was my first attempt at sort of platform. But when I joined into finance, I found it interesting because the things around emotion or human communication and a lot of the things that I learned around cognitive psychology were disconnected from the finance model, although it's really at the core of how the market works.
I want to pick up on that point because I think often when we look at tech and the intersection of technology and psychology and also behavioral economics, and you think of the likes of Thaler and Kahneman and Tversky and those who pioneered the field, just better understanding why we as humans do what we do, often we focus on the negative side, technology and addiction and the dopamine hits of social media and kids on screen time. But from your perspective, what I'm hearing is the potential here to tap into this in a much more positive, certainly a socially positive way in helping understand how we can use this technology to help people make better financial decisions, for example. So maybe you can build on how you see these two then converging in the field of finance. And as we all know, creatives, I consider myself a creative in the media landscape, our creative pursuits are entrepreneurial pursuits. But often when you chat to creative individuals, they may be highly skilled musicians or highly skilled orators. When it comes to reading a balance sheet and understanding how to apply for finance or manage their cash flow, there's often an asymmetry of information between them and their bankers. So how do we then use these technologies to better outcomes for individuals, Goh?
Yeah, maybe I'm really biased because of my background, being a creator, also being in tech. And I don't know how much you guys are familiar with digital music, but a lot of digital music is kind of like programming, configuration, understanding how algorithms work. But at the end of the day, you're trying to, let's say, create an emotional journey through the sound you create. And funny enough, I find finance very similar, where you're trying to make money, you're trying to stabilize your income or your cash flow so that you can live your life, so that you can have a happy life, or you can help protect your children or help them get through school, maybe to build a house or start a new career in a different country. And there's these different life ambitions, but to reach that, let's say, mechanism to be able to have this sustainable life, you would need to know the mechanics of different things, including things like how do you raise an income or how do you run your business so that it's profitable? How does the supply chain work? How does interest work? When I take out a business loan, how does that work? And how do I insure myself against the loan or actually against an accident in my business? And I think we're always in this gray zone between things that are very human and, let's say, life-oriented, and a lot of technical things that are behind that to realize that or make that happen. And I think this is how I perceive like today's world, where it's becoming more and more, let's say, visible how different technologies are impacting people's behavior, how gamification of maybe saving is changing people's saving behavior. And now we really need to step away from just like looking at technology as something to enable people to do what they did in the past, but thinking how these new technologies can make people think about what is going to make their lives happier, or why am I trying to save money? Why do I want to be financially independent? And getting deeper into that like human construct of who they are to know what they want to do with their finances. I think it's becoming easier to access that today.
It's almost as if you're going through a Maslow's hierarchy of what this technology has the potential to unlock from a financial perspective in terms of the broader applications of financial freedom and self-actualization as a human being, where we sit down and we say, financial freedom, what does it mean to you as an individual? It means different things to different people. It's not necessarily just about the money. It's about what the financial freedom enables. Josh, maybe to bring you in, I was reading an Economist article recently that really cautions against overhyping AI, because we've yet to see the killer app, those real-world adoptions that look hugely transformative. But just listening to what Goh is saying, I mean, you're thinking about this technology in exactly that kind of way, developing things that can be hugely transformative for individuals. So maybe you can just share some specific examples of what Tovie AI is working on, especially when it comes to now using these generative AI solutions in the financial sector to help people with these human issues when it comes to finance.
Yeah, I mean, the application of AI, as you say, the killer app, monetization of AI, for those of your listeners that are probably watching the stock market, for the month of July, we've seen that tech stocks in general are down across the board. There's this, I guess, sort of fear in the market at the moment as to, okay, there's a lot of capital spending on AI in general, but where's the returns coming from, right? And so there's this, I guess, view that there needs to be this killer app, right, in order to be able to monetize the technology effectively and for it to make sense. I view AI in a much narrower slice. I'm not one of these people that so much focuses on, let's say, having this general artificial intelligence that can do everything. I like to think of AI as segmented individual processes, individual use cases that tackle specific problem statements, right? Specific use cases and the value that they can release at those use cases. And so I think at the moment, there's this people that are not embedded directly in the technology and working with it on a day-to-day basis. There's still this mysticism around it, right? Whereby you look at it and you say, right, why is an AI automating everything? But if you look at individual problems, the applications of the technology are having tremendous results for the problems that they're trying to address, right? And so within Tovie, we focus, AI is a very broad category, as you probably know. There's machine vision, there's deep data analytics. We do what's called natural language processing, as you've already adhered to. I mentioned natural language processing. I like to think of it as technologies that automate human-to-human interactions, right? So wherever there's a conversation of some form happening, can we use AI to sort of enable that conversation in different ways? And some of those use cases will be customer facing in the sense that they will be used by organizations to enable customers to interact with the organization in a, I guess, more streamlined way. Some of the obvious use cases that your listeners are probably familiar with will be things like first line support, right? We've all called up our bank before and been put through to an IVR chatbot that's trying to route us to the right area, right? So those are the obvious cases. But there are actually use cases as well that are, say, more focused internally. So it's actually more about, well, how can we make the agents that are picking up the phone maybe better at their job? Right. So it's not necessarily about replacing people, but augmenting them. So you've got a contact center full of 150 people. Sometimes those type of contact center roles will be transient, right? They're not there to do that job forever. They come in, they work for 6 months, they move on to the next thing. So the AI actually focuses on making that person better at their job quicker. Right? So how can we get them to full operating capacity, full knowledge, within a month span as opposed to 4, so that from a business side of things, we are making a better ROI on that person, but also from that person's perspective, they're becoming more effective at their job quicker. And from the end user's perspective, they're getting better service, right? And again, these technologies also have interesting applications outside of the bounds of just, if you like, traditional based chatbots or augmentation of chatbots and things. You can think of conversational AI in terms of a wide variety of different things. So, for example, let's say you're an e-commerce business like Amazon, and you're taking, billions or millions of orders a day, and you have reviews on those orders, right? People putting reviews on products and things like that. How do you, at that scale, monitor the contents of those reviews to ensure that they don't include things like profanity and so on, and include like racial slurs? These are big problems to solve that historically require, hundreds of thousands of man hours to be able to do. And so from the perspective of the business, there's a cost saving there as well. But there's also something to be said about making the people that are doing these roles today, deflecting them into other areas of the business where they might add more value, right? Where they might get more fulfillment out of their roles. And so fundamentally, yes, there will be some job displacement from the AI technologies short term. But I think fundamentally, if you look at any technology, whether it be the spinning jenny, right, in the 1800s, or the invention of the automobile, everybody thought, okay, what's going to happen with horses and so on? People get displaced, they get moved into other industries, and fundamentally, I think you end up doing more meaningful work. And so, even though there is this fear at the moment that I think I've seen a meme going around where people are like, I wanted AI to be able to do my spreadsheet, and instead it's doing art and music and so on and so forth. I think this is just the temporary blip before we get to some form of end state. When that end state will be, I'm not sure, but I still believe that that's the route we're headed.
And to me, that's also been one of the biggest fundamental evolutions and leaps that we've seen when it comes to natural language processing, is just how much better the technology is at interacting with humans. And I just use the most probably widespread and accessible one to most listeners now, in ChatGPT. If you think about how that interaction unfolds, and you can ask the large language model to adopt persona of a particular historical figure, and you can have a conversation with him, and it feels a lot more natural than anything that's come before it. Coming back, Goh, to how BNP Paribas Cardif is thinking about this. I'm thinking about leveraging this conversational AI to enhance customer experience with finance. What are some of the things that you're playing with in the sandbox at the moment? Maybe you could just share some of the projects and what kind of problem they're solving for.
Yeah, and maybe just for the clarity for everyone, we use Tovie AI as one of our solutions for handling this conversational AI, being able to handle conversations with customers, also for internal usages. And so I just wanted to be transparent there.
Sure.
And one of the things that we've discovered in trying to, let's say, enter this kind of space, for me, it seems like we're repeating that we've experienced in the past when we did transformation. Josh talked about cars and, are we going to replace all the horses in the world? It's kind of a similar discussion where we're discovering more about our company, ourselves, as we try and do this transformation. I always think that these transformation projects, whether it was the ERP kind of things that we did back in the 2000s or paperless transformation, it's kind of like just another round of that. I think we're discovering, okay, what is core to our business? What is important for our employees? What's important for our customers and our partners? And we're currently going through a phase where we're trying to understand the new impact of having these, let's say, new level of automation. But fundamentally, it's still the same. We want to make sure that we understand how we can add value to our partners and how we can also have a positive impact on business and the market itself. And if you go specifically into the area of this kind of servicing that you can do with artificial intelligence or the benefits of artificial intelligence, the level of things that we can automate is becoming much more, let's say, advanced and more human-like. And this is an area for financial services. It becomes a little bit more touchy, and we start touching into the area around regulation. And I always think that, it's kind of like law, and the spirit of the law is very important. I think also the spirit of the regulation is also important. And sometimes I think that we need to consider that the regulations that are in place sometimes don't benefit the customer, especially if there's a lot of advanced technology that can actually help the customer. But just like the law, we have to anticipate, and we need to make sure that people don't take advantage of certain capabilities. For example, Josh talked a little bit about reviews, but today we all know there's a lot of fake reviews out there. right?
Mm-hmm.
And with AI, they're accelerating that. And in that same way, you can generate manipulative things with AI. And we have to make sure that before we start using the technologies, we have a very strong alignment internally as a financial company, especially if you're in insurance, that you're responsible and you understand the impact that you have when you try and use these technologies. You really have to have the right, let's say, North Star of where you make everybody look. Like one of the things that we talk about a lot is the impact that we have. And we think about sustainable finance. For example, making a whole bunch of people take out a bunch of loans for short-term profit is definitely not something we're aiming for. We need to understand the needs of the customer. We need to understand the deeper goals than, hey, we want to save money. It's like, what do you want to do with that money? Because that also gives you a better risk profile of the customer. So you know exactly how you need to serve them. And really aligning on this impact-oriented view of why are we doing our business, what's important in our business, those values, those have been very important in how we design the usage of the AI capabilities or any kind of automation that we have in our company.
It speaks to very much a shared value approach, which in the South African context, I think the local medical insurer that's now building out a bank and growing globally at a great rate is Discovery, that pioneered this shared value approach where it's thinking very much about how we can nudge people into making better behavioral decisions around their health and lifestyle choices, thereby improving their underwriting overall and also ensuring that they're more profitable, but that all the Discovery members are living longer and much healthier lives as well. And it's a shared value. When you look at that, let's maybe split it into two parts, because I think there's this internal fear amongst employees about, AI is coming to take my job, to Josh's point, and there's obviously the external, value to your customers and other stakeholders. So how are you approaching this internally in terms of, let's look at the white collar work that new jobs are being created? Yes, prompt engineers and explainability engineers, but it does look like there might be some positions that'll be made redundant. How do you manage that internal tension inside the workforce to ensure that you transition with them?
Well, I think a lot of companies will resonate that you don't always have enough budget to do everything that you originally wanted to do. Right? I'm sure the story of most businesses is that they have 100 things they want to do. They can only afford to do 20. Okay, let's prioritize. And I think in terms of like what we make the AI do we use the automation? Where do we use these new technologies? I think it allows us to cover more of the things that we wanted to actually do. So for employees, for example, we found from the usage of solutions like Tovie AI, we can get people off of tasks that people are spending a lot of, let's say, repetitive time doing. There may be internal questions or let's say some kind of training that we do for our employees that is rather repetitive. And we can help automate the engagement that an agent may need to get to be able to sell an insurance properly. And they're quizzed on certain things or they're learned to say a certain phrase in a certain way. Now that bot engagement helps automate that part. And that final, let's say, on-the-job training is the part where the human can come in and really bring that value. And sometimes it could be the most fun part of the job. So I'd like to see it. And this is how I try to explain it when we go through these transformation projects that, okay, now hand over all those, let's say less engaging tasks to the bot. And why don't you do the most fun part of your job? So in that sense, I personally find it a very exciting time.
Yeah, and a lot easier from a cultural perspective to ensure that you get buy-in across the organization. And then when it comes externally to the value proposition and that promise that you are going to deliver something that's useful to your customer, but at the same time not cross any ethical red lines or certainly act ethically with the data that you might have at your disposal, how do you approach that conversation?
I don't know, Josh, if you have some general comments, but if I were to just kind of speak from my perspective, it's, let's say, also regulated in a way that we only collect the information that we need. See, the thing is, the way that we do our model of the insurance model, it's paid through the premiums, and we're not like an advertising company that's going to go out and sell the information to do advertising, right? Which is the common model that you would see in social media platforms or platforms like YouTube. But for insurance, it's really about using the information to understand our customers better so that we can insure them in the right way. One of the worst cases that you could have is that you identify, for example, this person has children and you know they're underinsured for a case where they might pass away or may not be able to work if they get into an illness, and you know they're not covered for being able to sustain their family, but you just let it go, right? That's like being able to help them, but not doing that. We wouldn't want to do that. So in that essence, we tie what we can give to the customer to the information that we also collect, and always looking at that in this reciprocal way of give and take. This is really important. It goes back to the societal role that a company plays. You have to give and take. Otherwise, there's no point in your business in the end when you look at it a very long term. Like look at, as some people say, it's the infinite game.
Josh, just to maybe move on slightly if we can, when it comes to the technology, it's got great ability to scale, but you often need to localize as well, especially if you're a global multinational. So what are the key factors to consider when you're scaling a conversational AI project across global branches? How do you approach this challenge of localizing AI solutions to meet maybe country or region specific needs and some of the compliance requirements as well that may come along with that?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think in the scope of conversational AI specifically, obviously there's a lot of focus at the moment on large language models, OpenAI being one of the key proponents and ChatGPT, as you mentioned. But actually, conversational AI, although the word AI is firmly within that, is actually an amalgamation of different technologies. So large language models is a facet of that. Traditional based classifiers for doing things like intent classification or named entity extraction, so pulling up key pieces of context from text, can do a very good job. And then fundamentally having what we call a finite state machine, maybe for the more technical users in the call, they might know what it is. For listeners,
like a fixed model, right?
Yeah, so it's basically, think of it as like a business logic model whereby you have a state and then you transition from one state to another state based on rules, right? And those rules can be hard-coded rules, they can be data-based rules. So, right, for example, you might collect some information from the user and that might drive you down one decision path versus another. Why do I mention this? Well, because fundamentally being able to codify all of this stuff and adapt it to the market is really where this comes into play. So a lot of the use cases, right, for example, if we take insurance as an example, a lot of the use cases will probably be fairly similar across different geographies, whether you're doing a project in Italy or you're doing a project in Chile, for example. However, as you say, there will be market-specific things that will change. So being able to have a model whereby you have this logic codified, you have it templatized so that you can ship it to different geographies, but then you can actually modify it on behalf of the customer when you get there and adapt it to the requirements. And a key part of this is probably another buzzword that a lot of people speak about at the moment is what we call low code, right? So having drag and drop GUI that allows you to codify a lot of this business logic means that you don't need expensive developer resources to be able to do a lot of the legwork, right? You're actually putting the power of modifying the use case, as it were, in the hands of, say, less technical, but more customer-focused people inside the organization. So we're talking about people like business analysts or user experience experts, or even in the case of use cases where the fundamental, process that we are replacing or augmented is, say, like, for example, a contact center, even the actual contact center agents themselves, right? Because they understand the actual dialogue that they're having with the customer on a daily basis and the process in more detail. So that low code piece is really, really key in being able to scale that. But having the templates for use cases is also paramount as well. It means you're not starting from scratch and you're taking, things that you've already proven in one market and adapting it to another.
Just lastly, Josh, I've got to ask you, and you're very close to this, what really excites you if you look at some of the emerging trends that you believe are going to reshape the future of finance and insurance in particular?
That's a tough question. Let's have a look. I think from my perspective, actually some of the more, shall we say, boring use cases. So I can give you an example. Having done a fair amount of work in financial services myself prior to going full-time into technology, did a lot of work in investment banking, a lot of work in retail banking, specifically in the UK market. There's a lot of regulation that a lot of these banks have to adhere to. There's a lot of, shall we say, hoops they must jump through. There's a lot of pressure on them to catch things before they become a problem. And there's big fines if you don't do it right. And so I think these technologies, specifically around natural language processing, are opening up some really, really interesting use cases around that type of compliance work. So it might not be, shall we say, the most exciting stuff for some people, but it actually equates to big savings for some of these companies. I can give you an example. You have to adhere to things like KYC and AML. So you want to make sure that your employees are
know your customer.
And anti-money laundering. Yeah, no, too many
Exactly.
TLAs in the finance world. 3-letter acronyms, no problem.
I like my acronyms, exactly. So, for example, if you think about the amount of communication that's happening across, say, a bank like Barclays, right, which has, I believe, 150,000 employees across the globe, you're talking about, or Paribas for that example, you're talking about natural language comms in terms of Microsoft Teams messages. You're talking about audio transcripts. You're talking about masses of emails going backwards and forwards every day. So how do you have sort of a view to make sure that people are staying within the bounds that they're supposed to be doing? Right. And then escalating that to a controller to make sure that, people aren't doing business with Iran when they shouldn't be, right? Or that people aren't allowing transactions from drug cartels in Mexico to go through. So as I say, less exciting from an end user perspective, but these are really big problems to solve. And, generative AI has really opened the door to do some of these things in a big way.
Well, there you have it. Thank you very much, Josh and Goh, for sharing great insights and your experience into how natural language processing, conversational AI, is poised to transform the finance and insurance function significantly. Really fascinating that. That was Joshua Kaiser, CEO of Tovie AI, British-based AI startup, and Goh Hirose, who is head of digital acceleration at BNP Paribas Cardif, talking about their experience in driving digital transformation. To you, our listeners, thanks as always for tuning in to the Monocle Banking Podcast, and be sure to subscribe and stay up to date for more deep dives into the future of banking and finance. Until next time, I'm Michael Avery.